Good evening, everyone. This evening, we invite you to join our space, one that you're welcome in as we journey to understand the past with a quest for knowledge. Continued, a circle of space and time as we analyze the present, propelled with curvilinear energy to create design-inclusive futures. Think of this as a space of Sankofa, an African word from the Akan tribe in Ghana. It translates that it's not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind. You must reach back to reclaim that which is lost to move forward. Berea College, the first integrated and co-educational college in the South, says that the Sankofa symbolizes the Akan people's quest for knowledge among the Akan, implying that the quest is based on critical examination and intelligent and patient investigation. The symbol is based on a mythical bird, with its feet firmly planted forward, with its head turned backward. The bird takes an egg from its back. The Akan believe that the past serves as a guide for planning the future, and this wisdom and learning from the past ensures a strong future. The Akans believe that there must be movement and new learning as time passes. As this forward march proceeds, the knowledge of the past must never be forgotten. This evening, I'm thinking about how my design education began in 1989 in that chair right over there. This is a full circle moment for me, and in this room, in this building, I learned, fell in love with, and dreamt of the design methods I've been fortunate to be a part of in my design journey. This book started in this room, learning from fellow students and faculty in studio. From here, I understood Sankofa's growth from education to professional practice throughout North America and the world on empathic projects such as the one you see on the screen. Returning to UVA in 2017 to create Empathic Design, it's the title and name of our initiatives, our pedagogy, and design practice. We continue the circle. In my professional experience with empathic architecture, I've discovered its possibilities, learning how to design with inclusivity in spaces, systems, objects, products, graphics, and experiences. We define empathy in our work, as defined by social researcher Carla McLaren, as a social and emotional skill that helps us feel and understand the emotions, circumstances, intentions, thoughts, and needs of others, such that we can offer sensitive, perceptive, and appropriate communication and support. Since 2016, we've developed empathy-driven national and global projects, employing methods to bring untold narratives forward through design. It's evolved into our book, sharing perspectives of professionals from various fields, working diligently to do the personal and professional work to support moving forward while looking back. Participating in and sharing this work with the field is an honor. I thank the 11 contributors and those in attendance that you'll meet this evening, and the years of continued support from the A School. So to take us on this journey, we have 3 incredible shepherds, and they'll move us from space to space. They'll run the show, introduce you to our contributors, and gracefully guide us. First is Maya Jewel Page. She hails from Memphis, Tennessee. She's a Master of Architecture, Path 3 first year. I asked all the students to share some responses to the following questions, and the first was, what made you come to the A School? Your dreams in high school, your wishes. And Maya said, at my undergraduate institution, I worked at a prototyping and fabrication lab and instantly fell in love with design. I eagerly looked for a transition from my political science studies to design field, but struggled to see myself represented in the industry. The A School's commitment to JEDI initiatives and the diversification of the architectural industry drew me in. I asked what the favorite class or project or experience they've had at the A School, and Maya shared this work from the 6020 studio. It's from above to below, an observatory hill material archive. Dreams for the future, I asked, and she said, I hope to design and practice on every continent, sans Antarctica. Favorite designers and architects, Francis Perret and Heggie Design House. Our second shepherd will be Joyce Martin, and she hails from Alexandria, Virginia. She's a fourth year on the pre-professional track. I asked what made her come to the A school, and she said she's always been interested in art and design, and that whether making a miniature dollhouse with her mom or watching her papa refurbish an old family home. Joyce said she initially wanted to be an artist, but after talking to a mentor in her sophomore year of high school, she suggested that I should strive for more and challenge myself to do architecture. And this is Joyce's quote, and boy, it's been a challenge, a rewarding one. I asked her favorite class and project experience she's had at the A school. She said her favorite has been the community engagement workshop in Asheville, North Carolina, during the Empathic Design Blue Note Junction research studio. It was one of the first times she could live her passion for serving others as a designer. She enjoyed fellowshipping with community members and was honored that they allowed her to be in their space and shared their dreams. It was also one of the first times she felt appreciated for doing extensive research, and it's always been another interest of hers. Dreams I asked for the future. She said her first dream was to be gentler with myself, which she works on daily. She also dreams of a better balance between architecture and leisure life, and dreams for work uplifting the forgotten and fostering intergenerational connections. Favorite designers, Francis Correa as well, and also how he brings in innovation and familiarity to his projects, and that the balance inspires her work, especially in independent design research, where she's designing a mental health space in her dad's hometown of Baltimore, Maryland. And our last shepherd is Cole Rozwadowski, and he's from Culpeper, Virginia. He's a second-year architecture student, and for him, he believed that design can be a vehicle for positive change in the built environment, and felt like coming to the A school was the best way to learn how to make an impact. Favorite class and project, it's the Ravenna River project you see here, these models, and he loves seeing how these models came together on the North Terrace, and this is in 2010. Dreams for the future, he said he likes to participate in helping create more equitable and sustainable communities. And favorite designers and architects, Shepard Ferry, Tato Ando, and Christoph Neumann. So I'll pass it off to our shepherds. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Elgin. I'm Maya Jewell, everyone, and I'll start out by introducing our contributors who are able to join us today. We have Elgin Cleckley, NOMA, undergraduate architecture director, assistant professor of architecture, and principal of Empathic Design, and editor of this wonderful book that we'll be discussing today. Nina Cook-John, AIA NOMA, NCARB, founding principal of Studio Cook-John, Architecture and Design. We have Christine Gaspar, design and planner, former director of the Center for Urban Pedagogy. We have Katie McDonald, AIA NCARB, assistant professor of architecture, director of Before Building, and co-founder of After Architecture. We have Kyle Schumann, assistant professor of architecture, director of Before Building, co-founder of After Architecture. Dr. C.L. Bohannon, associate dean of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and associate professor of landscape architecture. And we have Mitchell Silver, FAICP, principal of urban planning at McAdams. Joyce, Cole, and I will be leading the panel through a series of questions and then opening up the discussion to the audience for further Q&A. I'll now hand it off to Joyce.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Hi, my name is Joyce, and as we guide you through this conversation, we seek to open up a dialogue with the panel and the audience about what it means to bring compassion to the design profession. During this time of renewal, happy April, we will take you through 4 growth phases, from a singular seed to a collection of flowers. Our questions begin rooted in the concept of self and branch out to the collective. We hope tonight will be an opportunity for understanding, tending to ourselves, and leading our community in a pursuit of growth. Let's begin with our first conversation, ego and identity. So, empathic design goes both ways, in which a designer must also take care of themselves. In what ways are you empathic towards yourself during the design process? Would anyone like to start?
really bad at it.
Wow. It's interesting because in the design process, I tend not to focus on myself. So that's why I'm struggling. To me, it is about the people first and the place second. And so I just try to extract, feel, listen, smell, absorb everything about the people and the place. And so I'm somewhat orbiting around the design issue or problem and don't put myself in. So when you said ego, I hope and I pray that my ego is not involved because it's not about me. I will tell you the story. I went to Pratt Institute for Architecture, and a professor said to me that his design is ruined the minute his client walks through the door. That so turned me off. I ended up taking urban planning because I was shocked. And I said, please tell me the profession's not like that. But even though he was a well-known star architect, I don't want to be that. It's not about me. So as I stated, I don't think I can emphasize it, any further that I'm secondary. My ego is secondary to the people and the place as I start the design process.
I think it's hard for us to answer this question because as design professionals, oftentimes, starting with architecture school, we're kind of working till the wee hours of the night and the weekends, and it doesn't necessarily change when you become a design professional. But I think one of the things that I do try to do is grant myself the luxury of time, meaning the time to continuously revisit whatever the project is we're working on. So work for a bit and step away and perhaps work on something else and then come back again. Because going back to this idea of a kind of layered experience, oftentimes for each project we're working on, there's a layered experience of what we're taking in around us. So the more space we give in between when we're actually working on something, as some specific project, the more inputs we can kind of bring to it from different spheres of our lives, from different spheres of different projects. And so it really, by granting us the space in between the project, it ultimately not only enriches us in terms of having a little more time with it, but the project benefits as well.
So I'm going to take it a slightly different way. Can y'all hear me? Mm-hmm. All right. So I agree with you that the space of or giving space and time in the process. I'm just going to reflect on this just from a studio professor perspective of actually allowing students to have the space and time to do the work, particularly when it comes to engagement, or empathy, in this particular way, to allow them to question and to wonder in that way, even though you have stuff you need to turn in and all these other kind of things that you have to do, but allowing that space for them to question and for them to wonder and to discover, I think is an important piece of that, and also hopefully help to take away the ego that professor had, and that it's other people's stories, and we probably shouldn't be centering ourselves in that process.
Get to break the whole thing. What a good question. You guys got real super fast. It's interesting that it's so hard for us. I think this is something that I'm working at. I literally started therapy a year ago for the first time in my life, and this is a real topic of conversation in therapy for me, so working on it. But I think it's so interesting to me that is so hard for us. And I appreciate that you all are bringing it up for us to think about. I want to say in the work, I did talk a little bit in the chapter that I wrote about kind of self-work and reflection and how that is a part of working with communities, because the work it can be really intense and difficult and emotional. And if we're not doing our self-work, then it's really easy for us to be triggered in the conversations with community members and to cause real harm. So for me, I think that that's a really important piece of it, is where we're taking care of ourselves and owning our own stuff, so that we can have awareness of that in the work.
Thank you guys for, even though a difficult first question, but we wanted to get right into it. So we'll go to the next question. This is actually for Elgin Cleckley. Continuing off of like ego and identity. In a field that's very quick pace and high pressure, it was refreshing to read about your design process, including rest, patience, and reflection. How have you been able to adapt this empathic design process through your career?
Thanks for the question. The whole way I look at design started when our parents would always put us on a Greyhound bus and send us back to our hometown in South Carolina for the summer. That seems like a weird place to start, but we go there and it would force us to sit in the land and sit in a place and quiet ourselves down and pay attention to everything around us. And Mitchell, you were talking about this idea of absorbing. I realized at a young age it helped me absorb everything around me. And then I started asking questions. I'd want to know the history of a place, the origins. Well, why is that building there? Why does that field look like that? How did we get here? It became a way to link to a space, to a place, and also to think about time outside of yourself. And so I write about this in my chapter in the book, that in my work I look at 3 different phases. The first I call it exploring, this idea of immersing myself in a place. But when I immerse, I start to ask the questions, just like the ones I just shared. The second, I think about the layers of a space, so like the social, the cultural, the historical, the economic, the political. And then finding that research asks more questions to a framework I call mind, hand, and body. The mind is how you connect with yourself to the space and the built environment. Hand is how you deconstruct everything around you. And then the body is how you think about others right within that space. I've really found, I showed some of the projects before, that became something that just became strengthened as the more and more spaces I encountered as well.
Great, thank you. And the last question that we have for ego and identity, this portion is what?
No,
And this portion is for Christine, and also for everyone else as well. But in chapter 1, Christine mentions how, quote, design education focuses so much on our egos. Elgin also gets at this by removing the letter E from empathic design, symbolizing the removal of ego from the design process. As design students, we want to be able to check our own egos at the door, to pursue a more empathic approach to work. How do we contend with our egos while like reconciling with the impact of our identity? Like, part of our identity has a lot to do with our work. So how do we how do we check our egos, contend with our egos, while also reconciling with the impact our identity has on the way we engage with projects? So this is for everyone, but this is just starting off with that chapter.
Sure. That's such a great question. I just want to thank you. Y'all are so prepared, and you just thought so hard about this, and it's so lovely, and it's giving us a chance to think about the things that we wrote and read in each other's work, so thank you. And I also just want to thank Elgin for putting this book together. It's really needed, and I'm so grateful for it to exist and be a part of it. So, but yeah, such a good question. I think maybe it's counterintuitive, but I think addressing ego actually means moving towards understanding how our ego is showing up and where our identities and where our desires and our expectations are actually showing up, right? Because I think if we don't pay attention to those things, they're still there, and so they're gonna show up. So in order to like be, it's like how we talk about bias, right? It's like the bias is there, and so the thing to do is to develop the tools to see it and understand when it's showing up so that we can interrupt it. And I think it's like that. So for me, a lot of starting projects is actually about sitting with our own identities and thinking about things like our power, our privilege, our positionality, and how those are showing up in the project and how they're intersecting with the other participants in the project. I really loved CL, the exercise that you talked about in your chapter. I won't talk about it because you'll probably talk about it, but I think that's a really cool way to start doing that as well. So yeah, maybe I'll just stop there. Others.
I want to address this fine line between ego and self-promotion. As designers, we do play a role in creating designs for spaces and places, but there's always this discomfort calling attention to yourself that you played this role. But I think as a man of color, and I think even from a gender point of view, women in particular, it's important to acknowledge that you played a role without feeling it's about ego. You know, I can go back and his work I did as playing director in Raleigh, North Carolina, which I was a visionary, but others have claimed credit for that. But as a black man in particular, wanting to inspire the next generation of designers and planners, I do want to say, yes, I was the person behind it, but have this discomfort. Is that self-promotion? Is that ego? And so I think we do have to reconcile what is the difference between the two. And having empathy, which is listening from someone else's point of view, no, that's nothing about ego. That's about recognition, because there are a lot of people that take credit for their work, rightfully so. So there's always this challenge. And I remember, I believe it was Maya had mentioned on the fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners, and we look at fellows and we noticed there was a challenge in women's application in particular. We wanted them to brag about the work, but rather than saying I, the majority of women said we, without claiming that they played a central role. This was a chance to talk about you're special, what did you do differently, yet we came out instead of I. So I do want to kind of talk about that thin line between self-promotion and ego. And when I heard your question, I don't know if that was merged between the two, but I do believe as designers, we're just an instrument, we're part of the process, and we should acknowledge not just ourselves, but all the participants that played a role, because to me, it's a collage of engagement that produced that outcome. It wasn't the designer per se. They're the storyteller. They're the interpreter of what they've heard throughout the process. And so that's when you ask the question, it kind of just stuck. Because a lot of people says, oh, that person's sending out something they did again before. No, it's not ego. It's acknowledging the work that was done and all those that were involved to make that a reality.
And I think, especially starting in architecture school, it could be how we redefine our role. And how we redefine our role, I think the words we use are really important. And when we talk about being facilitators and shepherds, as you've described, it kind of repositions our role as working with and in service of, rather than, even like simple things like instead of describing things as design problems, where we really go into communities or into any situation in which we're working, bringing the skills that we have to co-facilitate some kind of new intervention, right? And we're looking for existing areas of cultural abundance, existing areas of strengths, existing areas of possibilities in which we can facilitate and shepherd some kind of response. It's very different than thinking we're the problem solvers. We're going to come in and you have these problems, we're going to fix it for you, right? It's kind of, and no offense to anyone whose relative is an obstetrician, but a doctor versus a obstetrician versus a midwife, they oftentimes come to what they consider to be the problem of childbirth very differently. One working with the woman, her body, and what they understand as being a natural process, versus an obstetrician who oftentimes, not always, oftentimes is working within paradigms which work best for them to what they consider to be the problem of childbirth.
I think this is a great discussion. Thanks for the questions. just to maybe pick up on some of those points, I think that the idea that you have confidence in your work and that you show it is important. I know when I was first on the academic job market, I had an interview and I didn't end up getting the job, but the director of the program, she called me and she said, "Your work's so great, but you were just modest. You didn't have any confidence in yourself. You need to project, success." And so that's one, that was one person's reading on it, but it was interesting to me to look at myself and say, well, I like the work I'm doing, but I'm not apparently showing the world that. So how do you actually take stock of what you've done and communicate it to people in a way that it has meaning for them? I think the idea of ego at large overshadowing the design process is certainly something we see, but I like, some of the discussion we're having and what Nina's getting at, which is this kind of idea of observing, really taking note of what we're looking at and trying to design from there rather than coming and just superimposing our lived experience on, everything we do.
Thank you guys for your thank you all for your very in-depth answers. We're going to be now moving to the next part, and I'm handing the staff, Shepherd, sorry. I'm now handing the never mind. I'm now handing the mic to Cole.
Can you all hear me okay? We good? Sweet. So branching out from ego and identity, staying with our plant growth renewal theme, we're now moving to memory and narrative. And so to kick us off, Katie and Kyle, you conclude your chapter with, quote, "Rather than work to mythologize, architects today would do well to remember." And many projects throughout this book deal with uncovering untold narratives or stories that would otherwise go unacknowledged. And so as designers, how do we ensure that our work is not just retelling or overshadowing the stories of communities, but rather empowering those communities to be the ones sharing their stories?
That's a great question. Thanks. So yeah, I mean, we in the book present like one very specific project, Camp Argo Memorial, as an example. I won't get into like talking through that project, but I think like it's more about maybe our relationship to those like communities, to the stories that we're telling, and I think one of the themes that's already coming out today about kind of observing and listening is really, really valuable. Kind of seeing everything that you can see, observing everything. Sorry, can you hear me now? Distance, okay. Thanks. I think like this idea of like observing and listening is super important, and that's something that I also try to bring to like studios, as the kind of faculty learning side of things. Like observing and sort of collecting information, doing like the research, before you do the design, is I think a really important part of the process, and that has to do with like learning about sites, learning about the kind of narratives present in the project, the people who are going to be experiencing the project and our stakeholders in its creation. And I think we're also shifting away from maybe like this architect ego, like in this conversation, but also like generally culturally, I think. And that's important because the point I wanted to think of making earlier too is about collaboration. And so I think when we're working on a design project, as designers in the world, we're always working with teams of people to make these projects happen. We're working with other designers, other professionals, other communities. And so our job is to kind of orchestrate these different interests, these different bodies of knowledge. And I think that's a different sort of ethos than saying, this is my design, this is what it should be.
Great, thank you so much. And then our next question stems from mainly your chapter, CL, on storytelling. In literature, we encounter the concept of the unreliable narrator, where their credibility as a storyteller is more or less compromised. And so when we are dealing with spatial narratives, how do we ensure that we are uplifting stories that are true to their communities?
Yeah. One of the most simple thing is understanding that knowledge doesn't just flow from the university. We're not just the keepers of that, and that actually we can be we can't be the experts of other people's lived experiences. So leaving space, and Leone Sandercock, I referenced in the chapter, talks a lot about the epistemology of multiplicity, right? And so how and where knowledge is formed, and how that is carried through. And so that's where I think as designers, we could, take the input that we get, center those stories, but also, use our, what I call superpowers, to be able to use those narratives in design in a good way that actually centers the voice of community. So even just taking the simple stance of working with, right, not working on, is a way that you can start to do that as a process. And also thinking about this notion of like co-designing, working with, just something as simple as drawing with a community partner as they're telling their story, is an important process to do that. And then I'll share one last thing that my grandmother always told. She still tells me this. There's a reason why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? And so we should be listening twice as much as we're talking. And so utilize that in the process.
To follow grandma, but gotcha. I just wanted to share my first job out of grad school. I worked at a firm in Seattle, Washington, and they took one look at me and they were like, "Oh yeah, we know what projects we're going to put you on." I was like, what does this mean? And so they sent me to a small town called Longview, Washington, down the I-5. Anyone from Washington State, it's the down south, kind of west corner of Washington State. And I realized the project was to tear down a 100-year-old school in a community. And so you can imagine, you're fresh out of graduate school, you walk in, and then you realize real quick. And I mean, I would say that job really threw me for a couple of months, because immediately I was seeing the real life experience versus what I learned. The first couple of meetings were really rough, as you can imagine. You're showing up at a PTA meeting and you're saying, we're going to tear down your school, and just see how that lands. After about the third meeting, I was bruised at emotionally. I realized, all right, part of this, and you all started to talk about this, CL, you talk about this in your chapter, Liz Ogbu talks about it in her chapter as well, that how you design a workshop is really an incredible way to shift that collective. And so I had worked with others and the team, and we thought, well, the first question is to find out some grounding questions and empathic questions that would connect us with community. And so we found out that everyone in the community worked at one of 2 factories. They were at the Alcoa factory or the warehousing. So immediately right there, we understood there was a material language. And so we took the language of both of those factories, and we created this central kind of forest space in the school that you could actually etch your family's history on these plates that were made at one of the factories, and all these trees were made at the other factory. So all of a sudden now there was a connection to think about place, and everybody understood that their narrative was being told through this space. But that work is for us. Does this not work? That work is for us, right? We have to think about what the work is we do as designers to create a space for that conversation to happen. We also have to be really open to pulling ourselves back. The ego conversation we're talking about also. But we also have to think about, all right, well, what's that moment that makes everyone feel like they're part and connected to this intergenerationally, as you talked about in your interests as well? I think that matters.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to pass it on over to Maya to wrap us up.
Okay, great. Thanks, Cole. So thinking about communities and the conversation that we're having, we will, I don't have enough hands. We'll jump back to the individual and collective as our next growth phase. So general question for everyone and anyone who wants to answer. A common motif throughout many of the chapters is the contemplation of the dichotomy between the individual and the collective within designing public space. This seems especially pertinent when the design is focused on a particular figure, event, or memorialization, and that showed up as Harriet Tubman or John Henry James or even Camp Barker. So the question is, what is the most challenging part of balancing an important figure while also uplifting the self, the collective, and the future?
I'll start. So my contribution to the book was really deconstructing the process of designing the Harriet Tubman Monument in Newark, New Jersey. And so that was meant to be, as many monuments are, honoring a singular figure. And really, for me, from the very beginning, I knew that the story of Harriet Tubman wasn't a singular story. And not only was she multifaceted, you know, and there are many things about her that we didn't know, but how do we understand, you know, the stories of our heroes in ways that are more approachable? And one of the ways to do so that we can better connect to them, and one of the ways, you know, to do that with the Harriet Tubman story is really understand her story as a community story, right? You know, her successes ultimately came from the successes of the Underground Railroad, which was a collective effort. You know, she wouldn't have learned all the codes that allowed her to do all those heroic deeds without the support of that collective. But also, how do we extend that story through time, a time in which that she kind of operated, but also incorporate the members of the Newark's liberation story, right? The multiple people and groups and community members who supported liberation efforts in Newark, but also how do we bring those stories of liberation to today? So we kind of bifurcate a singular story into a story that's layered and tells a more complex story. And in so doing, if the reason that we put up monuments and memorials is so that we can be inspired, right, looking back to look forward, that kind of Afrofuturist Sankofa, where we see everything at the same time, the past and the future, then in order to be connected to this figure, we need to somehow see ourselves in them. And so the singular man on the horse or the person on the pedestal is much more, it's putting them at a distance for us, and it's much harder for us to be inspired in a very personal way from that. So it's, you know, for memorials to be most impactful, I think telling the story as a community story is one that worked better for us.
Just to maybe build on Nina's point, I think the project that Kyle and I wrote about in our chapter was a memorial to a collective memory. But one of the things that we found in really looking at the history of monuments and memorials was that oftentimes these things were implemented as a political means to revise history or to foreground a certain story. So many of the Confederate monuments coming at times like when the Civil Rights Movement was going strong. So not actually at the time of the original events, but as political tools in response to, you know, developments in people's rights and personhood. So when we're, you know, tasked with perhaps monumentalizing or memorializing something, we have to think about the political implications of the brief as well and what it's being used for.
Okay, we can move on to the next question. Thank you. Christine, in your chapter, you describe how empathy has opened up an important conversation on the relationship between designers and those impacted by their work. And Mitchell, you share how part of the American Institute of Certified Planners Code of Ethics, which intentionally speaks to social and racial justice. How might an empathy-based ethical framework begin to build on these same conversations, focusing on relationships, stories, and communities?
Okay, how's that? Yeah, this is a great question. How's that? Ooh, yeah. Let's see. Yeah, this is such a great question. It wasn't me. Yeah, so my chapter, in my chapter, I actually critique the term empathy because I think we use it as a proxy a lot of time for having something that's like more like an ethical framework. So, I appreciate the question. And I think in my chapter, I talk a little bit about these sort of two pieces that I think come out of the idea of empathy. And I think one is compassion, where we're like doing emotional labor and developing relationships with people. And I think that's super important. And then the other piece is about accountability, right? And how we create more explicit and formal ways that that we follow through on what we are promising or that we are building with other people, which includes like being accountable to harm that we cause and coming back and doing repair around that. So I think that I guess, I go into some details about things that I've done in my practices that have worked, but I think just even opening that question, right, of like, what is our relationship as designers to communities that we partner with, and how do we be explicit about what that means, and what we owe in that relationship, but also recognizing that it is specifically a relationship, right? That it's not an extraction, and it's not just like a professional relationship, but that like we are showing up as humans for and with each other. And then that means, I think that has a whole set of implications in terms of like how we act. And I don't think my design education taught me those things. So I think that those are things that I've been exploring in my practice over the years. Maybe I'll just sit there and turn it over to.
If you don't know, I served as president of the American Planning Association and the American Institute of Certified Planners. During my term as president, we wanted to take a fresh look at our code of ethics. And to me, our code of ethics give you a purpose. It's what you as a profession stand for. And I've looked at AIA and APA and all the others, but I wanted to call out specifically, what is our professional obligation as planners? And so I put that in the book as kind of a foundation of what would follow, because our profession over the past 150 years did harm. It did a lot of harm to many communities, and I felt it was important to acknowledge, apologize, and then atone, because repairing past harm has all three parts: acknowledge, apologize, and atone. Now, what does atone look like? It takes different forms. Could be money, could be something else. And so I was sharing kind of that platform that if you truly recognize you've done harm, then you have to atone. I start every public meeting apologizing to the community for the harm the planning profession has caused. It wasn't us per se, but I know harm was created as a way of acknowledging and apologizing so we can find a path forward. And so for me, it's very important as we have these conversations, we do have to listen as we start to have public engagement. And to me, the word empathy is listening for how other people feel from their point of view and not your own. I hold public engagement very sacred. And if I, as a principal, feel that one of my employees cannot do it, stay in the office and make maps. Do not engage the public. This is sacred conversations. You're dealing in for painful memories. Very often you go to a public meeting and it seems very contentious. It's not about this project. It's about 30 years of pain, of being planned to death with nothing happening or very harmful things happening. All that is being manifested at that public meeting. And you cannot listen from their point of view instead of your own. It's not going to work. I share in the book, right after Black Lives Matter, I was commissioner for New York City Parks. And right after the incident of George Floyd, I had a lot of my allies call me and say, hey, what can I do? What can I do? They wanted to show solidarity. I knew they were well-intentioned. But I said, that's the wrong question. Your first question is, how do I feel? Asking me what can you do is about you. Asking me how I feel about what I just witnessed on television, that's really trying to understand how I felt from that point of view. So if you truly want to help, why don't you just wait and first ask me how I feel to understand exactly the trauma collectively across the United States that people of color felt watching a man being murdered before their very eyes. To me, we had to process that first before we could do anything else. People are painting Black Lives Matter murals on streets. Fine. You know, that was very superficial. It was a sugar high. We did something. It had no lasting meaning. And so to me, after the listening, and I shared in the book what happened following that. So those are kind of the layers that we had to go through. It's listening how other people feel from their point of view and not your own. To me, is what to me what empathy is. So that when you do go forward, you can feel it, you can embrace it, you understand those stories, and not put it in a neat little box.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's on. To echo a little bit of that. So in the chapter, yeah. So how do I'm just gonna say it. So how do I say this? Yeah, I'm just gonna say it. So for the students that took my 701, some of y'all in the classroom that took my studio, and you were expected to do community engagement, right? To go down and talk to folks, but sometimes those conversations are very extractive. And so the very first thing that we did is, well, I told them, how can you expect someone to share their stories if you haven't even worked on your own, right? To even understand where you come from. And so we developed this process within the class to have some intentional dialogue and some active listening. They developed the interview questions. They interviewed each other, and then from that, you'll see in the chapter, each student developed their own deep map about their relationship between people, place, and community. Because I couldn't expect, and you shouldn't expect, community members to just be in this place where their stories are just extracted and we take them and run off somewhere and then do a design and it comes back. And also it puts the students in a position where it's like, oh, that was a little bit uncomfortable. It's like, yep, that's probably what community members feel like when you're just there firing off questions left and right, right? And so trying to model what that's like, but also it helps build community within the cohort because you found out a little bit about yourself and your classmates, and you realize that you are a human as a designer, right? So anyway.
Thank you for those very potent answers. I have to sit with those for a minute. So this is our last question before we broaden the conversation to the audience. Nina, in your chapter, you wrote about the Harriet Tubman Memorial, but specifically I was struck by your conversation of the removal of the Christopher Columbus Memorial that was there, or statue that had stood on that site previously. And there was some opposition from within the Italian American community in Newark regarding that removal. So that seemed to be a challenge perhaps in the design and kind of rectification process. For them, that statue represented a symbol of greatness during a time when Italian immigrants were persecuted in the United States. And considering the question of what stories belong in public space, how do we bring empathy into the conversation with those who feel supported or comforted by the prevailing narrative?
Yeah, so to give a little bit of context, I think many people recognize that the Columbus statue was taken down in June 2020 when many other similar statues were being taken down across the world. Previous to that, the City of Newark and the Parks Department and a local arts group had already been considering what stories should be told in public. They were working with Monument Lab, and they were working in the nearby park, Military Park, on one big monument there that I think it's called Rumors of War. And it's by, his name is slipping me now, but it's the same designer that did Mount Rushmore that had, he has a complicated history. So they had been going through a series of experiments, working with artists, and several of them had different kinds of responses. And then even on the night of the removal of Columbus's statue, there was a whole art response, Will You Be My Monument, where this one artist kind of created these pedestals and had young girls stand, and there was a photograph. All that to say, it was part of an ongoing questioning, even pre-2020, of, what monuments are. Why is it that most monuments are, are monumentalizing war in one way or another and are primarily white men. And how do we start to make space for a more layered, nuanced conversation about what stories get told in public space? And so, in the context of the kind of pushback by the Italian American community in Newark, but it's there have been similar pushbacks in Chicago, in other spaces around the country, in saying these monuments need to remain. And I think ultimately in Newark, it was about, the people who live in Newark have changed as well, the demographics in terms of who lives in Newark, right? So there's now a much smaller Italian community that's there currently, and the people who are living in Newark now are saying, this is not what we want to represent us, and this is the story that we want to be told. We understand that you thought that this representation of the Italian American community you have some connection to, and you think it needs to be there, but we don't think it needs to be there, and you are actually no longer part of this community. I thought it was important in my design response to recognize that statue to Columbus had been there, and so imprinted we left an imprint of the statue, the pedestal of statue, in the design of the monument, because it's important to me that people understand that had been there. That's still an important part of the narrative of what the Tubman Monument is now. So those who come to learn about Harriet Tubman and understand the monument as it is now need to understand that it's part of this whole process that included a removal, which was a part of a community protest moment, and as that response. And so I don't know if that means that the design is necessarily empathetic towards the Italian American community. We definitely recognize where their pain comes from. And I think oftentimes people who are in a position of power think that by sharing that power, it completely eliminates any agency that they might have. But really, it's more about making room. And how do we make room to include those historical stories that really have just been silenced but did also exist? And how do we make room? That park still has multiple other monuments to white men, and they're still there. And it's really just making space for the stories that have not been told.
Thank you so much. So to continue our journey this evening, we want to offer an opportunity for the audience to join in on the conversation. So if anyone has any questions.
Thank you for your talk. It's great to hear from all of you. A lot of the projects that you're working on are in areas where there is a lot of contestation over whose stories get to be told, and showing empathy for which communities are involved. There's multiple communities, right? There's not just the one singular voice sometimes. And that takes a lot of energy from you personally, I think, to respond empathetically to. How do you prevent yourself from being overwhelmed in these situations? What personal skills do you use to maintain the kind of clear-headedness you need and have longevity in this and not burn out?
Well, for me personally, I didn't talk about the creation of Juneteenth Grove. I've kind of ended with, a listening among our staff, and then who wanted to show solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. And so we created this space called Juneteenth Grove for protest, for healing. And so what gives me more drive is that it was healing from generational trauma. That Juneteenth Grove, didn't realize at the time, but it's very simple application of painting 19 benches of Pan-African colors, planting 19 rosebud trees, and just using the symbol of the red, black, and green at the entrance of the space where there were a lot of protests, where George Floyd's brother protested in that park, was very meaningful. I remember it was a year before Juneteenth became a national holiday. We also call it Freedom Day. And I remember as commissioner, I was getting all these requests for permits. And I just said, forget it, because there's no way, you can't have many people there. But as I was coming by there, when it was officially a holiday, to see all the joy in that park of knowing that people were going through the healing process, we went on to rename 28 spaces throughout New York City. We looked carefully at names and renamed other spaces as a way of giving people joy and helping the healing process. So for me, I think as a planner, a protector, I'm a guardian, I'm a healer, that working with staff, we were able to heal a lot of communities throughout New York City by giving them a space, seeing their experience reflected in a New York City landscape. So that's what gave me drive, to help with the healing process of going through some trauma. In a small measure, it may have been a redesign or renaming of the space, but we involved the community in that process and that collective healing. And when I saw the joy, for me, I think it was all worth it. And so that's what gives me that drive, to help heal, to help bring joy to a community that really felt trauma for so long.
So for me, it's actually being able to teach a course, and a core course in our landscape architecture curriculum, where every student that goes through our program gets a community engaged studio. So we get to tackle this together, and we get to do it collectively, right? And so, as a practicing landscape architect, I have a little bit of influence on some projects, but as an educator, you have a broader influence, because I have a lot of folks that come through my class, and then the students that graduate from our program are out changing the world in a different way. And so for me, I know that I'm not doing this work. Sometimes it feels like you're doing it by yourself, but at least with the students that have gone through the program, it's like, hey, we have some allies that are out there that are changing the course of how landscape architects can practice, community engagement, but also with empathy to actually do something good for someone else other than ourselves. So.
I guess, have you guys ever run into the issue where you perhaps found that a community's culture was so different than yours that there may have been barriers to having the same level of empathy that you would have had if you related to them more, and you had to how do you get through those barriers of really, I guess, letting go of your ego and connecting with something so different than what you're used to?
I think in my chapter I talk about this. I think that's part of my problem with the framing of empathy as the term that we use, because I think that's what empathy suggests, is that it's in the that you have to fully understand that feeling to be able to work with someone on their experience. And I think part of what I also critique is that because we frame it that way, I think we also then say okay, I talked to them and now I understand it, and now I can go ahead and design for them. And to me, you can't do that. And that having the sort of compassion and accountability framing that I'm talking about is about being able to show up and recognize someone's experience, but also recognize the limitations of your understanding of it. But that doesn't mean that you can't have compassion for it, and it doesn't mean that you can't be accountable to your partnership in the design process. And so I think there's also this challenge, right, when we're working with marginalized communities, that in the design process we're also asking people to just reenact their trauma, right? And that also can't be what this work is. It has to be a partnership that is about also people's strength and their joy and their desires, right, and their creativity and the things that they want to create and work towards, and how are we supporting that in our design relationship. And so I think it's important to work towards understanding people's lived experiences and being thoughtful about them. And I've been working a lot on like bringing trauma-informed lens into design process and things like that. But I think at the end of the day, it is also super important to just understand the limitation, right? And to understand, okay, how am I creating a design process that has a real structure to it and that has ethical, boundaries to it, so that we can collaborate together despite my not being able to understand someone's lived experience. And to me, part of that is that they are part of the design process throughout, and like they're paid for it, and their lived experience is one of the expertises, and it's built into the process from the beginning. So
And I think a part of being empathetic is also to not, one, come into a process with any preconceived notion. So, one, not assuming that you have more or less in common with anyone in the communities in which you're immersing yourself. But also understanding that designing the community engagement process is also an art, and also recognizing, one, certain power dynamics that are built into the relationships that are there. So when we were collecting during designing the community engagement process, oftentimes means multiple community engagement sessions, different sizes, meeting people in the spaces in which they are most comfortable, partnering with community organizations who are already doing work within the communities, who already have trusted relationships with people in the community, working in coordination with those people. When we were working on the community engagement workshops for the Tubman Monument, oftentimes, the city wanted us to have them at the museum downtown or at the library. Many people don't come downtown Newark, right? And the people on the mailing list of the museum don't capture all the voices that we were hoping to include. Also thinking about the interviewing process, there's a power dynamic there. So really trying to design a process which is similar to the StoryCorps model, in which friends are interviewing each other, or community, people who are already working in a community-based organization that people already know and trust. They're the ones doing the interviewing, or setting up booths in which people are responding to prompts with their own. So having multiple ways for people to engage, multiple ways for people to tell their stories. And I think then you get the kind of richest collection of stories, because of the diverse nature of stories that you get back because of different organizations. And so, you find where you actually have connections to many of these stories in ways that you never expected that you would have.
I'm going to give one example. This is in Flushing Meadows, Corona Park. This is where they have the U.S. Open, the big Unisphere. I'm sure you've seen it, this big globe. So this was a community where on weekends, the Latino population would go in droves. Not just the men, the families, mothers. And while the men were playing soccer right by the fields, by the Unisphere, the kids were kind of wandering. And the families were on the side kind of cooking. And so we looked at the Unisphere. It had this big reflecting pool and had these huge bushes that no one ever used. We decided, after having a conversation, they were looking for these special spaces, and we decided by talking, reflecting back, because you listen, but then you want to reflect back. Did I hear you correctly? You're looking for special spaces. We took out these bushes, put in this amazing mist garden. It became so popular for the kids. People were cooling off. The mothers with the kids were on the side playing. The boys could still watch their fathers play. It was so successful, and it was a minor intervention just by listening and understanding the dynamics. We notice in one culture, you have soccer moms, they go there in the minivan, the kids play, they're done, they go back home. But for the Latino community, it's the whole day experience. It's the whole family. And so by understanding the differences, we're able to design something that worked so well. And the misting stations, it's like air conditioning cools you off in a hot summer, but the kids love to play there. And that's where a lot of the cooking took place while the men were playing the sports. It just was listening, watching, observing, but then reflecting back. Did we get it right? That thing is so hugely successful now, is that now it's in such high demand. But that's another win-win that, I smile because we actually listened very carefully, understood the cultural dynamics. It's not just putting up a mural or putting up a statue or monument. It's how is the culture, like I like to ask people if they have trouble asking, do they feel welcome in the space? You have family outings. Tell me what it's like to go home. What is the experience? How are the tables set up? How is the food set up? What are the conversations that take place to understand culturally how people engage as they come together? I want to reflect that in design so that people feel a sense of being welcome. And so to me, it's a back and forth conversation, but this is one perfect example. You can see it online, the misting stations in right on the Unisphere. And it was just a win-win because we listened, reflected back, and then we went ahead and moved forward with the design. There's a question way in the back.
Can you hear me without the microphone?
Actually, we can.
Okay. I think over the next few years, a lot of us young designers might find ourselves in positions where we might not be as engaged with our work as we thought we were. So I guess if anyone's willing to share, what was that kind of moment of epiphany, if anyone wasn't necessarily working with empathic design before, like in a previous career, what was that moment of epiphany that kind of motivated you or acted as some sort of impetus to get you to kind of move forward towards work that you're proud of? Words of encouragement for us specifically. Yeah.
I mean, I can remember I had a crystallizing moment where after I graduated from architecture school, I was working for an architecture firm in Boston, and it was like a great firm. It was very small. The people who ran it were really thoughtful. Like I learned a lot of things from them that I actually really brought into my practice about partnership and about working on projects where you're the right fit for each other. So I appreciated it. But actually going back to that first question about like kind of even how we, I don't know, stay motivated. There was this moment where I was working and it was stressful, and I was working on like a home renovation for a very wealthy client, and there was like a delay in these like $500 like towel bars that were being shipped from Germany, and a lot of people were really mad about it and were yelling, and I was like, so stressful. and then I went home that day, and like Hurricane Katrina had just struck in the Gulf Coast, and I was just like watching it on the news, and I was just like, fuck this. You know? And it was just like, this job is stressful and hard, but about the stupidest possible thing, you know? And I can be stressed, but let me make it matter. And I went maybe like within a month. I went to this conference at the time called Structures for Inclusion, and met a bunch of people who were starting to practice this in this way, or who were moving towards these kinds of practices. And I met this guy David Perks, who I wrote about my chapter, who I later went and worked for in Mississippi. So yeah, I don't know, that was my moment, and I just like tried to use it as like, wait, I feel a misalignment, like let me look around to find other people who are better aligned, or who are also feeling that misalignment.
That's a great question. And I think we all have these moments, right, that are there. And the one I had was the project I talked about earlier. After those projects, it went really well. And so the firm said, well, you're doing great on this, so we're going to put you on justice architecture. That was the term for prisons. And so I had spent 2 years designing schools, and I was in love with it. And budgets were really low for the schools, because the way it operated in Washington State, I'm not sure if it's the same now, how you voted meant the amount of money that went into the coffers for either structure. And the Clinton administration had just passed those bills that also then increased the scale of justice architecture. I'm just going to use the term they use. So they put me on the justice architecture team because I really love drawing in AutoCAD. And they said, well, we need people on that who work really fast. And so I did it for 6 months, and it was going great for them, but it was going awful for me. And like I completely had a breakdown about it.
And I realized that I had to make a decision. I mean, I think these are the points that you come to in your career. And I said, well, I can't do this. By the way, at the same time, they gave me a raise. So like everything was set up for me to do that for a while. And I said, I just can't do this. And so it sent me on this real journey to find more about myself. And I think what's important for all of us, and I know that all of us do this in our work, is we have our own mission and vision statement. And I think it's important to write yourself that, say every 6 months, about who am I, what do I want to do, where do I want to go. It's always good to check in, because you know folks you talk to and they say, I don't know how I got here. Like I would never wanted to get to that place. But I also believed wholeheartedly in patience to know that it would come. And so I moved to Chicago, I started teaching, and I also worked for a firm that helped in low-income communities in Chicago. It took a while. I took the pay cut, but I was happy. And I realized that sometimes you have to sacrifice yourself in ways that push you. I also think you have to be careful about who you're talking to about these things, because some people would say, okay, my mom was saying, how can you do that job? It's cost, it's going to pay you this much. But you think, okay, what's in my heart? What do I want to do? What's the message I want? And if it's of service, I know I'll feel good when I go to bed at night.
Yeah, great question. Mine was in Harlem. I was doing my thesis in grad school, and it was called Lift Every Voice was the report. And I'm walking down the streets of Harlem, looking at the buildings, documenting the architectural character and the land use, and somebody saying, wait, this is not about the buildings. It's not about the buildings at all. It's about the people. And it really got me to think about the anatomy and soul of a place. And from that point on, I started walking with a different lens as I did my work. And so when people were complaining that all these teenagers are walking up and down 125th Street, they're intimidating. I'm saying, wait a minute. When I go to the mall, I watch all these white kids walk up and down the mall with no bags. The same as 125th Street. Teenagers want to be seen and be seen. That was their hangout. But once I had those different lenses, I started seeing things differently. And from that point on, I changed my approach to observing and listening. And I stopped taking surveys because I just watch people, how they behave, and they fill out these surveys. I'm saying, interesting, you're saying this is what you do, but I watched you and you're doing the quite opposite. And so by having a different lens, that spark happened in grad school. And from that point on, I focused more on the anatomy and soul of a place, observing, listening, and watching, and having that different lens. Another example, Commission New York City, we had signs, literally in New York, that said you could not loiter in a public park. Now, the word loitering means to sit or stand idly by without an apparent purpose. Newsflash, that's what you do in a park. But if you're 5 black or brown teenagers, those rules are racialized. And so, but everyone said those signs have been there all that time. But because I had that different lens, I was able to see it. So I'm grateful that while I was in grad school, I got that lens. So that was my epiphany, and it changed my career from that point forward. I couldn't advocate that for my employer, just like you were challenged at your first job. But I found a network with the American Playing Association where that became my tribe, where I can share these thoughts, because my employer's like saying, look, you need your paycheck. Great idea, but this is what we have to do. So until I got more credibility and seniority, I had to kind of do it on a separate track, but then everything kind of came full track. So that was my epiphany back in Harlem.
So thank you so much for this panel. My question, I think Nina, you broached on this when you were talking about like contending with Italian American narratives of memory and how they conflicted with like the like changing tide and like who we want memorialized in public space. And I'm thinking about how we maybe often fall into the trap of considering community as a monolith of like the community wants this, and I don't think I've ever been a part of a community that's like agreed on how things should be like fully. And so I'm wondering, like, in this exercise of empathy, how to parse through the like sometimes conflicting opinions or like narratives of a place, and like what should be forefronted and included in a design, and like how to kind of like parse through what you're being told to find like what is essential, and like find that middle ground that will tell the story of a place without like reducing it down to like any one thing.
Yeah, and I think no one thing is going to do everything for everyone. I think that's the first understanding that we have to have. And we often come to with a response that allows for multiplicity. Multiplicity is like my go-to, kind of not only incorporating multiple perspectives, but allowing for multiple readings and allowing for layered readings. And I think that allows for the most expansive interpretation, and the most people can feel connection to that without it feeling like a compromise, right? Not that compromise is necessarily bad. Oftentimes we think compromise mean either this or that or some middle between them, where I like to approach it with a kind of yes and attitude, where we'll incorporate that and that and that and that. And it's about how you approach and engage and move through it that you actually can start to read those narratives, and that it's complex, and we lean into the complexity to allow for the multiple readings. So that's how we address it.
Okay, thank you everyone for contributing to this conversation and joining us tonight. We're extremely grateful for the opportunity to be a part of your individual journeys, furthering our individual journeys, and we really hope that this conversation continues throughout Campbell Hall, far and wide, long after tonight's event. I'm going to hand it over to Elgin.
I just wanted to say thank you all for coming, and a big thank you to all the contributors. Really appreciate you coming and also traveling and being part of the book. But can we give a big round of applause to Joyce and to Maya and to Cole for their incredible work?